The US held an anti-Iran meeting at the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, July. It didn't succeed in rallying up members against Iran, and push came to shove in the form of a resolution. By August the 11th, the US had a draft resolution, revised draft resolution, ready for the Security Council to vote on. Why? To extend the UN arms embargo against Iran, as that expires on October the 18th by way of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran nuclear deal. But the US resolution failed. It was bound to. But what now? Will the US pull back or push yet harder to destroy the JCPOA and pressure Iran? What might it do? And what if the resolution had passed? What would it have meant for Iran militarily? For answers, stay with me, Leila Faramarzi, on Iran Today. I'll be talking to some MPs today. The latest hot topic in Parliament has been the Bourse, but the US resolution still riles up heated discussion with every parliamentarian I've come across. Here's an MP from Ardebil.
The US is often not content with one single issue. It will definitely try to make a fuss around Iran, mainly in the member states of the Economic Cooperation Organization, or the ECO. The Americans, in cahoots with the Zionist regime of Israel, will make arrangements for a new scenario to facilitate interference with Iran's domestic affairs. The United Arab Emirates was a starting point. I think that this scenario will continue so that new schemes will be drawn up against Iran and new sanctions are not unlikely.
We see now that the talks held in the run-up to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, proved the legality and legitimacy of the positions of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the sovereign rights of the Iranian nation, and made the world public opinion believe it. Just think about the anti-Iran consensus before the JCPOA. Iran was subject to Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, allowing for military action. But today, only a tiny state stands with the US in its draft resolution for the extension of arms embargo against Iran. I think that the US has to reconsider its position.
US Secretary of State Pompeo threatened, should the resolution fail, his country would trigger the snapback mechanism. That would literally snap all pre-JCPOA UN sanctions back on Iran. But the US is no longer party to the JCPOA, as the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers pointed out. And so it is not entitled to cherry-pick clauses of that deal. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell agrees, as does John Bolton. Bolton, however, has a very different reason. An architect of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018, John Bolton was at the time National Security Advisor to President Trump. He now says the resolution is not worth the risk. It'll weaken the US's veto power. Pandering to the JCPOA, in other words, would only place importance on it when the US has pulled out of that deal. Mr. Khoshcheshm is a political analyst who tends to present his view in detail. Let's hear him out.
Of course, everyone knows that the U.S. exited the nuclear deal 2 years ago, and there is no chance they can, allege to still be a party liable to initiating the trigger mechanism. To do so, they need the companionship of the signatories to the deal or member states of the deal. Iran, China, Russia have all stressed their strong opposition to this such an interpretation of the nuclear deal. They believe that the U.S. is no more a party of the deal, so it's not liable to go for a trigger mechanism.
The revised version of the resolution was more polite. Rather than push for extending the arms embargo indefinitely, it said the embargo extension would prevent Iran from freely buying and selling conventional weapons and shall continue to apply until the Security Council decides otherwise. The Security Council, fortunately but expectedly, decided altogether otherwise. The embargo was not extended to begin with. About the voting,
Despite months-long efforts by the US to secure the vote of other nations against Iran, we saw in practice that it failed and the US resolution was dismissed shamefully. Even the traditional allies of the US refused to cooperate with it and abstained. And two big powers rejected the resolution. First and foremost, it indicates the termination of the US hegemony, which it has been pursuing for half a century now. US officials were claiming to enjoy the same hegemony at the global level, but we saw exactly the opposite.
As for the scenario that didn't happen, what if the US resolution had won the vote it hoped for? The question is whether Iran is militarily independent enough for that not to have even mattered.
When it comes to defending Iran, one might think that Iran is not much in need. Of course, everyone would like to see the high-tech production of the world, modern world arms that have been manufactured by different world countries. Definitely, they have something to offer from the viewpoint of technology and high-tech. But still, it couldn't, keep Iran back, and it could not harm Iranian defense if the sanctions are extended.
On Defense Industry Day, Iranian President Rouhani is to unveil a couple of significant achievements. Defense Minister Khatami said those would be a select couple of numerous naval, missile and drone-related achievements. We have managed to fulfill more than 90% of our defense needs with good quality in spite of sanctions. And today, Iran is #1 in the region for producing defense equipment, he said. Khatami continued, "We are determined to defend our country and the regional state's security. Wherever we need to change or enhance our defense achievements, we are able to turn it into a new product and put it to use." He's not bragging. Iran is not a big spender on arms, unlike Saudi Arabia or even some of the smallest regional states. But it tends to make the most of the least for unconventional warfare when in need to defend its territory. How much loss would it be to Iran should the arms embargo against this country in fact be extended? Or would you say Iran is militarily independent enough for it not to make much of a difference?
Iran has boosted its capabilities in arms development. Many nations in the world are currently looking to buy arms from Iran. Iran has grown into a center of excellence in terms of missile manufacturing. Today, missiles are serving as our tool of power, tool of deterrence.
As a regional heavyweight and key holder to strategic choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz, Iran feels responsible for and in charge of protecting the Persian Gulf waters. Tehran's relatively modest defense investments in recent decades have yielded some impressive niche capabilities, enabling long-range precision strike, naval guerrilla warfare, etc., as the Washington Institute put it in counting some achievements of Iran. Say, the production of small arms, light and heavy weapons, munitions of all types, drones, rockets, missiles, including anti-ship surface-to-surface and SAM systems and SAM systems, light armored vehicles and small warships, for example, midget submarines and frigates. I interviewed an MP before the vote on the draft resolution. Her prediction materialized. Now I'm talking to others to see what it'll mean for the US and international well-being. Was the nay from US allies a one-off, or might it set the world on a new path?
I think that a new chapter opened for the US, particularly in its unilateralist foreign policy. From now on, the Americans must show prudence, and they should not fall into such self-imposed snares. It taught them a big lesson, so that they would refrain themselves from unilateralism. I personally think that they would not be able to take any further audacious act, like triggering the snapback mechanism. The US's failure to win consensus at the UN Security Council showed that it has lost its international standing.
Goes without say, actually, if the US's action, the one out of many, was in breach of international law to begin with, or at the very least disrespectful to international norms, reversing that action would be saving those norms and the reputation of organizations that uphold them. What really matters here, though, is that a trend of breaching the law was broken, abnormal American actions that were normalized by persistent pressure and bullying. Testament to that is this reaction to the question, was the US act illegal by international norms?
If we are waiting for the Americans to honor international laws and obey international institutions, we will be wasting our time. The UN Security Council, where the US wields a veto power, opposes many of US conducts. However, the US oversteps all limitations. President Trump has terminated many international treaties because he has concluded that those treaties were no longer securing US interests.
Till before the final groundbreaking rejection of an uncalled-for US demand, the arms embargo resolution, almost every analyst told me, what does it matter if it's legal or not? The US doesn't care about the law. But now the Security Council did itself proud. It proved that it doesn't matter if the US doesn't care about the law, because if it acts as though above the law, it is not above legal international bodies. It doesn't have to be, no more. In demanding to extend the arms embargo, the US is in breach of UNSC Resolution 2231, because that is the resolution that legally endorsed the JCPOA of 2015.
Instead of respecting the provisions set forth in the JCPOA, the United States pulled out. It was a violation of UN Security Council resolution, which had been voted by the United States itself. What is approved through an international treaty whose signatories are UN member states remain subject to international law and all necessary mechanisms are envisaged therein. In the JCPOA, it has been noted that should any dispute arise between the signatories, a commission shall be established to settle the dispute. The Americans, instead of forwarding any possible opposition to the JCPOA provision to said committee, have chosen to pull out of the JCPOA.
The accord, the JCPOA, was announced between Iran and the 5 permanent UNSC members plus Germany in 2013. At the time, the then US Secretary of State John Kerry emphasized the snapback clause as a safety net for the US if Iran failed to keep its end of the bargain. Iran's obligation was to limit its peaceful nuclear program in return for UN sanctions to be lifted off this country. Iran did commit, as testified 15 times by the UN nuclear watchdog, the IAEA. Yet the US unilaterally pulled out of the multilateral deal and has been campaigning against Iran as if it was still party to the deal. How can that be legal? Time for a quick break to see what other media outlets have to say. For that, I give you Shahrzad.
Hi, my name is Shahrzad Manucheri, and we'll be reviewing the latest update on US's humiliating failure at the United Nations Security Council and its repercussions. Tasnim News takes a look at the defense minister. Iran open to arms trade after US humiliation at UNSC. Iran's defense minister, Brigadier General Amir Hatami, mocked the US's humiliating defeat after the rejection of its bid for the extension of the UN's arms embargo on Iran, expressing Tehran's readiness for arms trade with the Friends. Speaking at a press conference, General Hatami said that Iran would take any opportunity to work with friendly countries to supply its technological and arms demands and to sell its products. Highlighting Iran's progress in the defense industry under the pressure of sanctions, Hatami said more than 90% of the country's military and defense needs are supplied locally at present. In an article by The Independent, we see Trump says US will have a deal with Iran within 4 weeks, if he is re-elected. Donald Trump has promised a new nuclear deal with Iran within 4 weeks if he is re-elected in November, according to a video of his remarks from an Inside New Jersey fundraiser. Footage from a campaign fundraiser shows the president addressing a crowd of packed-in supporters, none of whom appear to be wearing masks or socially distanced, while at the home of a friend of the president who died from the coronavirus. It's unclear what a new deal would look like, though it follows a pattern of deadlines set by the president during his re-election campaign, including a healthcare overhaul and a vaccine for COVID-19 that have not materialized. Tasnim News claims U.S. to get more isolated if it attempts to undermine UNSC again, says Iran. Iran's former foreign ministry spokesman said that the U.S. will get more isolated if it tries to undermine the credibility of the UN Security Council again. The international community, once again, and with a clear voice, rejected the U.S. reckless and futile attempt to undermine the United Nations Security Council credibility. The American regime should take a lesson from its total failures and stop shaming itself at the UN. Otherwise, it will get isolated even more than now, Sayed Abbas Musavi tweeted. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
Trump's USA is known for deal-breaking on an international scale. But since our focus is Iran, we are examining the JCPOA and the US's endeavors to destroy it beyond repair. Its present administration, to quote Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, has become the first government in UN history that not just violates a binding resolution it itself sponsored, but also punishes those governments and companies that uphold international law by implementing its provisions. It has been seeking to supplant international law with its own domestic laws. The thing is, even if you're doing something wrong, you have to do it cleverly. I mean, what cleverness do you find in US actions?
We
have to be prepared as such political games are fabricated from time to time to keep the world busy and waste our time. Therefore, it has become a routine. The Americans are trying their best to undermine all of Iran's strengths. It's because the only nation resisting U.S. interests and forming a front of resistance against the U.S. and political entities following U.S. order is Iran. The U.S.'s injustice-based interests and not Americans' interests have been definitely threatened.
It missed, fortunately, because the bullseye at the far end of the shooting range was not Iran. The US's longer-term target appears to have been the UN itself. America seeks to use the UN itself to effectively destroy the world's body. That is the belief of Zarif and Western pundits.
The veto power wielded by the U.S. and other 4 permanent members is a tool in their hands to behave illegally in the world. That allows them to do whatever they desire. Freedom does not mean I can do whatever I want. Rather, it means I deserve my rights. Such right is recognized for only 5 states. The power of veto is an unjust power they are monopolizing for themselves. I want to say the UN structure is based on discrimination.
On a smaller scale, had the resolution hypothetically won, it would still not have affected Iran alone. Eli Geranmaye, an Iran expert at the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, said, "If we are in a situation where there is such a fundamental clash between the United States and other permanent members of the Security Council, they are going to have a much more difficult time pushing through resolutions on areas where the United States may have previously been able to persuade Russia and China to come aboard."
The United Nations was established for the international law regime formed on the basis of bilateral and multilateral treaties between nations and also on the basis of international norms to materialize. The United Nations is expected to safeguard peace and security. The United Nations Security Council, as the governing body, is the highest executive body to implement decisions made based on the international law and the UN Charter. The UN Security Council is expected to safeguard peace and security. It should not become a venue for one permanent member of the UN Security Council to implement its own decision. Like other permanent member states, this specific state has been unequally awarded the power of veto, which enables it to dismiss any resolution proposed by other countries.
Regarding our present arms embargo resolution, China and Russia had warned beforehand they would veto the vote should the resolution win the minimum 9 votes out of 15 at the Security Council. Makes you wonder why the US even bothered with its resolution in the first place. In answer, it appears to be more a matter of temperament born of misconception or complacency. Imagine a teenage brat with the intellect of a child but strength of an adult. Foreign Minister Zarif wrote in the Global Times, The US fickleness and unpredictability have nothing to do with masterful implementation of game theory. Rather, whether it comes to its mismanagement of COVID-19 at home or its undermining of peace and stability abroad, the current regime in Washington has no real plan except to frontally assault those who stand by the rule of law.
The U.S. political structure incorporates expansionism, injustice, and discrimination. If you examine the U.S. power, you will see it owes its strength to the Third World. The Americans are showing the bloodiest behavior in a bid to safeguard the interests of their political, economic, and military businesses. If we imagine a political, economic, military triangle for the U.S., we will see that political, economic, and military officials are close relatives, either by affinity or by consanguinity or ideologically.
The US actually went way overboard this time to undo itself even. In disregarding warnings, it hurled the ultimate insult at the very notion of multilateralism and totally disregarded the deep-rooted concern of its traditional Western allies party to the JCPOA. Wouldn't it cast doubt on international deals and organizations if the US did succeed?
Most of these international bodies were created by the Americans themselves. Former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said that UN was created for the Third World, borrowing from Mrs. Thatcher. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, the U.S. military action was billed as illegal, but Rice said the UN was created for the Third World, that the U.S. was not required to respect the UN norms.
Western parties' fundamental concern with Iran is that it will totally pull out of the nuclear deal and even the NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that supervises nuclear activity of its member states. As it is, Iran sped up its nuclear program after its Western partners to the deal failed to practically operate in STEX. That's the trade instrument to counter U.S. secondary sanctions against countries dealing with Iran by cutting the dollar out of dealings with this country. If the U.S.'s main goal for trying to extend the arms embargo was to reduce the possibility of Iran's deterrence, it looks like a lost cause, because Iran's determination for developing its deterring force is mainly driven by the isolation and shortages it suffered during the 8-year war with or by Iraq. But how far would Iran go to resist U.S. suppression of its defense industry and dealings? Is it prepared to suffer any amount of loss, I next asked.
Even if the resolution had been passed, it was no surprise. We have already seen such resolutions passed against us. Such decisions have already been made against us, and we have been slapped with sanctions. But we have never been stopped on our path. This one was no exception. It would have not harmed us. Even if it had been adopted, it would not have any impact on our arms and defense industry thanks to our remarkable progress. We have made progress while sanctions were in effect.
President Trump claims talks would be inevitable if he were re-elected, although he has a very strange way of showing interest in talks. But what if the US changed course? Might Iran then hold talks with the outlaw bully, as FM Zarif would put it?
The leader made it clear that negotiations with the US would be meaningful if the US and its leaders would sit down with Iranian counterparts for quid pro quo. It would not be acceptable that the US continue its sanctions against us and Iran agree to talks. Neither Iran or any other independent government would accept such conditions.
Whatever the pros and cons in an argument, what matters is that logic and justice get the final word in. This time, the UN Security Council and international community faced their moment of truth in deciding to respect the rule of law over the law of the jungle. They showed the playground bully a bigger bully. We shall return to see if the lesson has been remembered. That's it for today. Thanks for watching from me and the whole team. Do watch again at the same times next week and each week after, as you never know what's on. And don't forget to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.